Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So I wanted to make the next video in our series on Introduction to International Relations. So I've been thinking about IR a lot and the different theories. We made videos on realism, videos on liberalism, and we'll probably circle back to some of those things as they become pertinent. But as I started putting together my syllabi and I finished my syllabi and then thought about, okay, what am I going to talk about this semester? One thing that I wanted to make a video on was really an introduction to American foreign policy, or introduction to even just broader foreign policy. Something that is oftentimes taught in international relations courses, but can also be taught in American government courses. Depending on what specifically we're looking at, it might be an IR, you might take it in a American course or an IR course. I usually spend 1 or 2 weeks on it in an American politics course. You could spend a whole semester on it in a international relations course. So I just wanted to today build a video about really just an introduction to foreign policy. So let's just start at a basic conceptual idea. So imagine a crisis emerges in another part of the world, outside your home country, outside the United States. Maybe a hostile government threatens one of its neighbors. Maybe a hostile government is building military forces. Maybe even that potential fighting will disrupt trade. Maybe even civilians begin fleeing the region, creating a humanitarian and a refugee crisis. Or maybe an American ally requests help or requests assistance from your country. We might ask and we might debate and think about, what should the United States do? Should it begin diplomatic negotiations to try to walk that conflict back? Should it impose economic sanctions? Should it provide weapons to the threatened state? Or maybe should it even deploy American forces to the region or to that country? Or alternatively, should it conclude that the conflict does not directly threaten the United States and simply remain out of the conflict? So those questions are really at the center of foreign policy. And if we put it in the context of America, those questions are at the heart of American foreign policy and the kind of questions we ask in an introductory course, all the way up to what policymakers, what academics, what practitioners ask. So when we think about what foreign policy is, foreign policy really refers to the goals a government pursues beyond its borders. So if you take me for American government and we use the OpenStax textbook, that's the definition. Many of your textbooks, regardless of what they are, will give this definition. The goals a government pursues beyond its borders and the strategies it uses to achieve those. So the strategies, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. It encompasses the decisions a state might make regarding diplomacy, trade, alliances, military force, international institutions, foreign assistance, maybe relations with other governments. These things are all part of American foreign policy and foreign policy thinking more broadly. So American foreign policy is therefore not a single doctrine or a fixed set of beliefs. It is an ongoing political process through which policymakers determine what the United States wants internationally. And we know this changes from one administration to the next. Maybe not wholeheartedly, maybe not dramatically, but some aspects of the foreign policy change. Might ask one administration might ask what developments around the world matter to American interests and what instruments should be used in response. Sanctions versus military force. So to really understand American foreign policy, we need to kind of examine three basic questions. What is the United States trying to achieve? What is the strategy that the U.S. is trying to achieve? We can ask, who makes American foreign policy? And we can ask, what tools can policymakers use to perceive those objectives? So we're thinking about what is the goal of policymakers. So what does American foreign policy seek to achieve? Before we dig into that, let's think about, or I guess while we dig into that, is we should create a definition defining what the national interest is. So the national interest, something you've read about in your textbook or you may have heard, refers broadly to the objectives that a government considers important to the security and well-being of the country. Political leaders frequently invoke the national interest, but they do not always agree about what it requires. So, at its most fundamental level, American foreign policy seeks to protect the United States. That's pretty straightforward. Policymakers seek to protect the population of the U.S., of course, the territory of the United States, and all countries are striving to defend their political independence. So this includes defending the country against military attacks from outside forces, of course, terrorism, emerging now, cyber operations, now and formerly espionage from foreign governments. The State Department just put out a report where they talked a lot about espionage and influence from outside countries. And so when we think of national interest, it's really from any external threats. So it also involves attempting to prevent hostile states, hostile organizations from acquiring capabilities that could endanger the United States. So security, however, is only one foreign policy objective. It might be the biggest. Being able to defend one's territory might be the biggest, but it's not the only one. The United States, all countries, also pursue economic prosperity. American policymakers thus seek access to international markets, secure trade routes, something that we're seeing a lot in the news right now with the Strait of Hormuz, reliable supplies of important resources, again, something you're hearing about with the Iranian conflict, and natural resources out of that region, out of the Strait of Hormuz, and now some other shipping lanes that are being impacted by the conflict. And of course, policymakers want a stable economic environment that the country can trade in. So when we think about this, a conflict thousands of miles from the United States might seem on the surface, well, that's so far away. But that conflict can still affect Americans by disrupting, as we're seeing, again, energy markets, limiting access to critical technologies. When we think of Taiwan and China, this idea of disrupting technologies and chips comes to the forefront. Could interrupt supply chains, could destabilize the international financial system. So we see what might be happening on the other side of the world could still impact domestic economics and domestic standards of living. So policymakers care a lot about those conflicts, even if they seem to be so far away. So foreign policy also involves the protection of American citizens and interests abroad. The United States maintains embassies, maintains diplomatic missions around the world to represent the country, communicate with foreign governments, and assist Americans outside of the United States. So we've all heard of the Department of State. The Department of State describes its central responsibility as representing American foreign policy abroad and advancing the interests and security of the American people. So a further objective is the preservation of a favorable international order. Something that we could dive in. You might take entire courses at UNC. We have courses on this, about this international order. So when we think about, okay, for our purpose, just at the basic level, an international order is a set of roles, institutions, relationships, and expectations that structure interactions among states. So the United States has frequently sought an international environment in which no hostile power dominates strategically important regions. International commerce can continue and American allies remain secure. So American foreign policy has also regularly included the promotion of political values. So here, presidents, members of Congress have often described democracy, human rights, political freedom, and the rule of law as important American principles. The United States has used diplomacy, foreign assistance, economic pressure, and of course sometimes military power in the name of advancing these values. So this creates one of the most persistent debates in American foreign policy, and that emerges when it's election time, emerges when it's presidential election time. This debate over interests and values and what the U.S.'s role in the world should be. Should the U.S. cooperate with an authoritarian government? When doing so, advances an important security objective or an important economic objective, or should the U.S. not engage with authoritarian regimes? Should the U.S. risk damaging a strategic relationship to criticize human rights abuses? And we know different administrations handle this differently. We also know that some administrations handle this in a way that many of their supporters don't like. In class, when I'm talking to students about this, I use the example of when Joe Biden, former President Biden, met in Saudi Arabia, I think it was in Saudi Arabia, with MBS, and they fist bumped, and a lot of Biden supporters, maybe more liberal people on the Democratic Party side, said, why are you meeting with this autocrat? And the Biden administration would counter, well, we have strategic values and economic initiatives in this region that we have to maintain. So sometimes we deal with non-Democrats. Questions emerge like, should democracy promotion be considered a vital American interest, or should the United States concentrate more narrowly on its physical and economic prosperity? And so we know that sometimes that is a difficult balancing act. So these questions do not clearly have automatic answers. Why Biden? Why other presidents go to Saudi Arabia? Well, we need that trade with those countries. So foreign policy does require policymakers to rank competing objectives and make difficult choices among them. So something that we mentioned at the outset that we should circle back to is this idea of grand strategy. This concept of grand strategy helps organize these choices that administrations make. So grand strategy is a government's broad plan for connecting its international objectives with the resources and instruments available to achieve those goals. It addresses questions such as, which regions of the world are most important? We hear a lot about the Middle East. We don't hear as much about parts of Africa. Which threats should receive priority? Why do some threats receive a response and others do not? Which allies should the United States defend? A huge question right now with military confrontation in the Middle East. How much military power should the country maintain? We know that's a debate every time that a budget proposal is passed or even introduced. When should the United States act through international institutions? A huge debate over the past 25 years since the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Should America do things alone, or do we need international institutions to be alongside us? And of course, how much of the country's economic and political resources should be devoted to international leadership? Again, a huge debate over the past several decades. So different grand strategies provide different answers to these questions. Advocates of international engagement argue that the United States benefits from maintaining alliances, participating in international institutions, the UN, NATO, organizations like that, participating in organizations that support open global economics. How much should the United States be involved in organizations that prevent hostile powers from dominating important regions of the world? Southeast Asia, for example. So, conversely, advocates of restraint argue that American leaders define the national interest too broadly, assume unnecessary commitments, and become involved in conflicts that are not essential to American security. So other approaches emphasize primacy, selective engagement, offshore balancing, things we've talked about in previous videos when it comes to this debate between realism and liberalism, where people talk about democracy promotion, diplomacy, international law. So here, though, the central disagreement is not simply between supporting and opposing foreign policy. It concerns the appropriate scope of American really involvement in the world. What is the America's place in the world? So although people commonly refer to the United States foreign policy or the U.S., maybe shorthand thinking about foreign policy, we know that the U.S. isn't simply a lone decision maker when it comes to American foreign policy. American foreign policy comes from many institutions and many political actors. We know that the president does occupy a central position. The Constitution identifies the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They get the TV time, they get the focus. We know that the president negotiates treaties, nominates ambassadors, receives foreign representatives, and directs the executive branch, which includes the departments and agencies responsible for diplomacy, defense, intelligence, and international economic policy. Here, presidents possess several practical advantages in foreign affairs. They can often respond more quickly than Congress. Congress oftentimes is okay giving the executive more power when it comes to foreign policy. The executive, the president, receives extensive intelligence and military advice. They communicate directly with foreign leaders and represent the United States at international summits and maybe international negotiations. However, the president does not control foreign policy alone. The Constitution gives Congress substantial authority. So let's think about how Congress can declare war. regulate international commerce, raise and support armed forces, approve government spending, and enact legislation affecting sanctions, foreign assistance, trade, immigration, and of course, national security. Congress, led by the Senate, can also provide advice and consent on treaties and confirms ambassadors and other foreign policy officials. American foreign policy is therefore shaped by a system of shared and sometimes contested authority. But the president still has a lot of power. However, Congress still has a role. The president may propose a policy, but Congress may actually refuse to finance it. Congress may impose sanctions that the president considers too restrictive. Legislatures may conduct oversight hearings, investigate military operations, block appointments, or attempt to limit executive authorities. So if you turn on C-SPAN and you see folks in the executive branch being grilled by Congress, this is the oversight we're talking about. So the division of war powers is controversial here, as we've been seeing with the Iran conflict. Congress possesses the constitutional power to declare war and authorize military funding, while the president serves as commander-in-chief. Over time, though, we have seen that presidents have frequently deployed military force without a formal declaration of war, producing continuing disagreements about the appropriate balance between executive flexibility and congressional authorization. So here we see a battle between the executive branch and Congress. So I'm going to wrap this up. I try to keep these under 20 minutes. In the next foreign policy video, I want to talk about some of the instruments of foreign policy. So at the outset, I talked about economic, military, diplomatic, and that's where we'll pick up on next time. Thank you.